The topic of today's lecture is per capita GDP. First, let's try to talk about the motivation behind per capita GDP. For that, I'm going to show you some data. So this website is based out of World Bank. So World Bank run a data website, and what we are looking at GDP in current dollars for different countries. So let's start with our familiar United States. In the United States, as we all know, GDP is around $19.39 trillion. Our next door neighbor, Canada, who has a GDP of 1.653 trillion, which is like. Then let's look at countries like China, which has a GDP of 12.238 trillion. On the other hand, countries like Russian Federation has a GDP of 1.578 trillion. India has a GDP of 2.597 trillion. On the other hand, countries like France has a GDP of 2.583 trillion. Sweden has a GDP of 538 billion. On the other hand, Mexico has a GDP of 1.15 trillion. So one thing is pretty clear, GDP does vary across countries. But the intriguing question is, if you look at Sweden, which has a GDP of 538 billion, and Mexico, which is a GDP of 1.15 trillion, we all know Mexico is a developing country. Whether Sweden is a high income or developed country. Now the question arises, how come Sweden's GDP is lower than Mexico's, still Sweden considered as a developed or high income country, whereas Mexico is not considered as a high income country? Now, to get into those details, I would like to share with you a little bit more data. So this is a list of countries by nominal GDP, and what I'm looking at, Wikipedia is a good way to get data, but often these data are not updated. Fortunately, in this particular Wikipedia page, data is fairly well updated, so it is important that you should not be citing Wikipedia for your academic work. So here we have GDP as calculated by IMF, GDP as calculated by World Bank, and GDP as calculated by United Nations by country. So let's look at the World Bank data. Now these data are slightly different because there are different methodologies they use to calculate GDP. So we'll focus on World Bank GDP data. As we all know, United States is the richest country with $19.39 trillion. And as we go down, China has 12.2 trillion, Japan has 4.8 trillion, and we can go down this list and we have countries like Tuvalu with $40 million as GDP, or Nauru with $114 million as GDP. By the way, Siena's annual budget is around $100 million. So you can imagine whole country of Tuvalu has only 40% of Siena's budget. So having said that, so let me first go back to some specific example. So as I showed you, Sweden has a GDP of 538.04 billion in 2017, and whereas Mexico has a GDP of 1,149.2 billion in 2017. Now the question arises, how come Sweden considered as a rich country, or also often as a high income country, whereas Mexico is not considered as a high income country? To understand the difference, we have to also understand that all countries are not equal in size. And when I say size, I'm not talking about geographic size, but size of the population. Now, Mexico may have higher GDP simply because it has more people. So to understand whether the country is high income or not, it's important that we need to weight the country's GDP by population. We can do it by looking at something called GDP per capita. So GDP per capita is nothing but GDP over population. So you have to take the GDP of a country and you divide it by its population. So let's go back to our example of Sweden and Mexico. So in Sweden in 2017 the population was 9.9 million, whereas Mexico have had a population of 129.1 million. Mexico's population is almost 13 times more than Sweden's population. So when we look at the per capita GDP, let's calculate per capita GDP for Sweden. So we divide Swedish GDP in 2017, which was 538.04 billion. So we convert it into million and divided by its population. What we get per capita GDP of 54,347. We do the same exercise for Mexico, and what we find, Mexico's GDP is $8,901. So Mexico's GDP is less than 10,000, per capita GDP is less than $10,000, whereas Sweden's is more than $54,000. And that's the reason Sweden is considered as high income country, whereas Mexico is not considered as a high income country based on GDP. So what about the United States? Where do we stand? So I'm going to show you some numbers, and this is real per capita GDP of the United States, and we can see our real per capita GDP is close to $52,000, which is substantially higher, and that's why US is considered as a rich or high income country. Let's look at which are the richest countries in the world in terms of per capita GDP. For that, I'm going to take you to again Wiki website because they have updated data available. Now, what do you think is the richest country in the world in terms of per capita GDP? Do you think US is the richest country? So let's check it out. So this has a list of countries by per capita GDP, and here we go. So again, let's look at the World Bank list. So first country in the world in terms of per capita GDP is Luxembourg, with a per capita GDP of $104,103 as of 2017, which is followed by Macau at $80,893, Switzerland at $80,190, and if you go down the list, where is United States? And here we are, United States at $59,532. So we are not among the top 5 even in this world. Having said that, let's look at some of the poorest countries in the world in terms of per capita GDP. So we are going to go down this list. Let's look at Burundi, and their per capita GDP is $320. Have you ever wondered how people are living at $320 for a year? Or Malawi with $339, Niger $378, Mozambique $416. So in this world, we are talking about a lot of differences in per capita GDP. We have extremely low income countries like Burundi, Malawi, Niger, and Mozambique or Central African Republic. On the other hand, we have extremely high income countries like Luxembourg, Switzerland, Norway, United States, Singapore, Denmark. Now, often question arises why certain countries are rich or why certain countries are poor, and we'll be taking up those questions later on.